Okay, hello and good evening, everyone. Today I'm speaking to Ivan Katchanovski. He's a professor in international relations, political scientist at the University of Ottawa. More importantly to this conversation, he's Ukrainian, and he did a lot of research on the area. So, Professor Katchanovski, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. I want to get into the conversation of Russia and Ukraine. Before this conflict started, many of us still referred to Ukraine as the Ukraine. Um, it was not really on our radar, but probably should have been. But the origin of this conflict, is it fair to say that it started in 2014, or does it go back even further than that?
I think this is correct that the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine goes back to 2014, which was a crucial point in the origins of this conflict, which Russia escalated very drastically by launching illegal invasion of Ukraine this year. But the conflict itself started with events which took place in 2014, and it escalated afterwards after Russia responded to kind of retaliated or escalated to the overthrow of the Ukrainian government by means of the Maidan massacre. So Russia annexed Crimea, which was a pro-Russian region, and they also started to support separatists in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine. And there was also Russian military intervention in Donbass in support of separatists. But there was a civil war taking place in Ukraine since 2014. And this war also was a very important event, which kind of directly goes to the events in 2014, because this was started also in 2014 after the Maidan events, which took place. And I researched these events for a very long time as a scholar because of their importance.
Okay, so I want to get into understanding Maidan because that seems to be one of the most contested historical events of modern times. The Western media, if I can use that broad term, says that it was a Maidan Revolution. Some critics in the Western media say it was a coup d'etat or a putsch. And then obviously the Russian media says it was a complete coup d'etat and Western intervention had occurred. So how do we go about understanding that event, and why is it so crucial? Why is the fact so contested, if I can ask that?
I think this is a political issue. And so obviously each party of this conflict wants to present their own narrative and want to kind of use their own definitions of what took place in Ukraine in 2014. And Western media and Russian media, basically, they rely on their government positions or narratives, and the same concerns Ukrainian media. But as a scholar of political science and a scholar of Ukraine, it's important for me to look actually what happened, not based on statements by different government officials, by the media, but actually what happened based on evidence and based on political science theories and definitions of such different events. And I'm actually now writing a paper on this very topic, on this issue of how to define events which took place during the Maidan, or transition in power which took place during the Maidan in Ukraine 2014, and also how we can define the war taking place right now between Russia and Ukraine according to the evidence, original evidence, and according to political science theories and definitions.
Okay. On the events of Maidan, my understanding has been President Yanukovych was in power. He was democratically elected. Now, in Western media, they always say he was democratic but corrupt. I don't know why corrupt is so relevant, but that's what has always been said. And then the story goes that there were protests at the Maidan Square, and an uprising came that overthrew his government. There were also involvement of snipers at the day. Is that more or less a fair assessment? And I actually want to leave it to you to sort of tell us the details of what occurred and what we're missing. What's the important facts?
Yes, this is the standard narrative which is given by the media, including top media like the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and BBC. And again, this is this kind of narrative is often accepted by or taken at face value by many people who do not have any kind of knowledge of actually what happened in reality, or are not concerned for a variety of reasons, maybe political reasons, or maybe because of ignorance, or because they don't care about Ukraine as much. Well, they did not care about these events in the first place when they took place, but now they became very crucial and very important. So according to my research, and again, I'm doing this research based on academic evidence, based on political science theories, not based on any kind of government positions or government statements, I can say that there is plenty of evidence of what took actually place. And the term which is often used and repeated by the media about the revolution of dignity, actually this revolution of dignity term was coined by a far-right leader of Svoboda Party, who actually was one, which actually was one of the political parties of Maidan opposition, which took place in Maidan protests. But in addition to this political party, again, along with other elements of the Maidan opposition, oligarchic opposition, and far-right opposition, was also involved in the Maidan massacre, which was, according to my research and overwhelming evidence which I collected and which is publicly available, including evidence which was released by the Maidan massacre trial investigation in Ukraine, shows that actually this massacre of the Maidan protesters and police was a false flag operation, which involved snipers in Maidan controlled buildings, basically Maidan snipers, who massacred both protesters and the police in order to blame the government forces for this massacre, falsely, basically by pretending that the massacre was by the government snipers or police. And this was done specifically to delegitimize the government of Yanukovych, which was relatively pro-Russian, but was basically also kind of concerned with their own wealth and their own prosperity. There was so-called family enrichment and so on of close relatives and close friends of Yanukovych, but it was the democratically elected government. And so this massacre was used to overthrow this government of Ukraine, and it was a successful operation. It succeeded in such overthrow, which was, again, not only kind of massacre, mass murder, basically, of taking place in downtown Kyiv, in the capital of Ukraine, in front of thousands of witnesses, media cameras, and television crews, and so on, from different countries of the world. But this was also a major crime. This was mass murder taking place, and this mass murder was also a major human rights violation, and this also was not a democratic action, which is often actually because Maidan was presented as as democratic movement, which overthrew Yanukovych as a result of peaceful mass protests taking place, and that he basically fled Ukraine because he was the one who was responsible for this massacre of the Maidan protesters. But evidence is undeniable. So this is like beyond any kind of doubt that this massacre was perpetrated not by the government forces, not by the government snipers, or the police, special unit of police called Berkut, a company whose members were charged with this massacre, but by the snipers who acted on orders from the Maidan opposition, including far-right opposition. And this is also evidence of involvement of foreign involvement, in particular admissions by 8 Georgian ex-military members that they were members of Maidan snipers groups, and that they witnessed this massacre taking place. And this was done on orders of Maidan leadership, and also on orders of former leaders of Georgia.
So you say Georgia, former leaders of Georgia was involved. Question is why? Why would the far right, I mean, they are far right, but can you give, why would somebody stage that stage instability in Ukraine? What makes Ukraine such an important country? And because we're trying to, I'm still struggling to make sense of it. You say there was a false flag operation. These were the far right and neo-Nazis, the Svoboda party, I mess up the pronunciation there. They wanted to blame the government. They wanted to overthrow Yanukovych. But Georgia was involved. Why are the foreign governments involved there?
No, I don't think that the
Okay.
Georgian government at the time was involved in this massacre.
Yeah.
There are testimonies by 8 Georgians who presented evidence, including Maidan massacre trial, and who testified in Italian, Israeli, U.S. television documentaries, and for Macedonian television interviews, and also for the Maidan massacre trial investigation.
Okay.
And testimony of one of these Georgian ex-military members was accepted as the Maidan massacre trial as evidence. It was presented there, and his identity was confirmed, and they also revealed their names, identity, and supporting information, which is consistent with my studies of the Maidan massacre, which took place. So they do not say that the government of Georgia at the time was involved, but they say that the former government of Georgia, leaders of the former government of Georgia, which was led by Mikhail Saakashvili, were involved in this massacre because they went to Maidan and they acted along with Maidan leadership. And they named specific leaders of the Maidan opposition who gave them order to massacre both police and protesters. And this is consistent with evidence, overwhelming evidence, which was revealed by the Maidan massacre trial and investigation in Ukraine, including testimonies of the absolute majority of wounded Maidan protesters who testified to the Ukrainian Maidan massacre trial and investigation that they were shot by snipers, not located in government areas or government controlled buildings or areas, but they were shot by snipers from buildings which were controlled by the Maidan opposition, like the Hotel Ukraina and other buildings which were under full control or in the area which was controlled by the Maidan opposition at the time. And they testify also that they saw such snipers in these buildings shooting at other protesters at the time, or that they witnessed, or that other Maidan protesters told them about snipers located in these buildings. And this is consistent with videos. There are videos, for instance, by BBC, by Belgian television video, and by Ukrainian television video called ICTV, which shows snipers in Hotel Ukraina shooting from the windows of Hotel Ukraina in the direction of Maidan protesters. There was no police at the same location. So this is like kind of evidence, which is just part of the evidence. In addition to this, there are forensic examinations, even by government experts, by medical forensic experts from the government institutes in Ukraine, and they found that absolute majority, almost all Maidan protesters were shot not from the front and from horizontal or nearly horizontal directions, which you would expect if they were shot by Berkut police on the ground in front of the Maidan protesters, but they were shot actually by from different directions. They were shot from the back or from the side, from the left and right side, and from the top to bottom, very steep directions, which are consistent with locations of Hotel Ukraina and other buildings which were controlled by the Maidan opposition, or were located in the area which was controlled by the Maidan opposition at the time when these snipers were shooting Maidan protesters. So this is consistent with such evidence, and this is also consistent with ballistic examinations of bullets. Initial forensic examinations which were conducted by government experts using computer system, automatic system, did not match any bullets from Berkut police, whose members are charged with the Maidan massacre, to any bullets which were extracted from bodies of Maidan protesters.
The snipers, how did they I mean, who is behind them? You obviously said the far right. You know, it was you can pinpoint it to the far right in Ukraine. Can you maybe give us a background? Who is the Ukrainian far right? Because
So I think this is very important issue. Actually, who was given order to massacre Maidan protesters? And I'm doing my research only based on publicly available evidence, and I do not have any kind of access to evidence about involvement of individual, like politicians or individual persons in this massacre. So I cannot say actually who actually gave order to massacre Maidan protesters based on publicly available evidence. I know that there are testimonies about involvement of leader of Maidan Self-Defense, who was one of the founders of far-right Svoboda Party, a Freedom Party, which was originally called Social National Party, after German, again, basically Nazi party, and it was neo-Nazi party, but he joined opposition, oligarchic opposition party called Fatherland, before the Maidan took place, and he later joined another party, which was called People's Front Party. In addition to this, testimonies of these Georgians, they testified that another leader of the same party, Fatherland Party, was involved in this massacre, who became head of presidential administration and of Ukraine after the Maidan, and they name some other politicians who actually gave order to them. They said, for instance, that former kind of president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, was the one who was supposed to pay them, to give them money after to pay snipers who massacred Maidan protesters, and that the money.
Poroshenko, the president after Maidan. Yeah?
Yes, he became president after Maidan, and this is not immediately after Maidan, but he was elected first president in May 2014, few months after the Maidan, and so they testified that in this video, in Israeli television video, they said that he was supposed to give them money for the massacre, but the money were not given us. So I cannot evaluate this evidence because I cannot look into. I'm not a criminal expert, so I do not have any access to any kind of individual data, but this is what they testify. But again, so this suggests that not only like far-right, again, so far-right involvement was important, and they included members and leaders of far-right Svoboda Party, but also Right Sector, another far-right organization. And they also provided evidence of such involvement. For instance, from BBC, there is a BBC video which shows snipers shooting into the direction of BBC crew and Maidan protesters from one of the windows of the Hotel Ukraina on the 11th floor. And a government investigation in Ukraine revealed, after I did my first study, which I presented initially in 2014 at the seminar at the University of Ottawa, Ukrainian Studies seminar at the University of Ottawa, and later in 2015, in August, I presented this study at the annual meeting of the American Political Science Association in San Francisco. And after I did the studies, actually, Ukrainian government investigation revealed that for the first time, they revealed publicly that that in this same room, which was filmed by BBC television, as a location of snipers shooting into them, and also in Maidan protesters, that this was a location, this room, Hotel Ukraina room, was occupied at the time by one of the leaders of Svoboda Party, far-right party, Svoboda, and that there were other members of this party, of the parliament of Ukraine, from this party, living in the same hotel on the same floor in neighboring rooms. So this is just one evidence, and this Ukrainian television video, which shows at the time of the massacre that Ukrainian television filmed a person with shooting from this window in the direction of Maidan protesters, and this Ukrainian television journalist publicly stated that this, at the time of the massacre live, he pointed to this window and said that there are snipers shooting in the back into Maidan protesters. And this was location this was not just accidental location. This was actually, as I mentioned, a room which was occupied by the leader of one of the leaders of Svoboda Party, right party, which suggests such involvement in the massacre. But again, I'm not sure who actually was at the room at the time and so on. But this such evidence of the link. And in addition to this, there were also videos and admissions by members of a special Maidan company, which was based in the music conservatory, and which was also later filmed at the Maidan, at the Hotel Ukraina during the Maidan massacre, that they actually shot police, and they were linked to the right sector, which is another far-right organization. In addition,
so is there, just to clarify, there's more than one far-right movement in Ukraine?
Yes, there are different ones, but two major ones, which were like Svoboda Party, which was represented in the Ukrainian parliament before elections, before the Maidan, and they also became members of the Ukrainian government after the Maidan. And one of the Svoboda Party representatives became head of the Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine in charge of Maidan massacre investigation right after this massacre took place. So basically, this is just one example that they were appointed to investigate Maidan massacre, even so can
investigate themselves. Okay.
Yes,
So
so basically they were important to investigate themselves and their own kind of other far-right organizations and members and so on, and their kind of allies from other Maidan parties, from oligarchic parties like Fatherland.
So when Vladimir Putin says that there is neo-Nazis in Ukraine, he's not onto nothing. Is that correct?
No, I think this his claim or justification for Russian invasion of Ukraine is based on false claim about Nazis basically in power in Ukraine or having or sharing power in Ukraine or being members of the Ukrainian government. This is a false claim, and even recently Lavrov, former current actually Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, claims that there is a Nazi regime in Ukraine, so they talk about Nazis basically as in power in Ukraine or sharing power in Ukraine. And Lavrov also and many other Russian government officials falsely claim and define that the Maidan was a fascist coup, which was again not kind of correct, because this was not only far-right involved in this event, and it's not yet clear, for instance, if this was just organized by the Ukrainian politicians, including far-right, or if this was done with involvement of other countries like the US. So that's why it's kind of much more complex. But the Russian government claims used to justify this illegal invasion of Ukraine about Nazis in Ukraine government and in power are false. But claims by the Ukrainian government and also claims by the Western politicians and the media that basically far-right and including specifically neo-Nazis have no influence, real influence in Ukraine. They have very limited support because they are not represented in the parliament, are also false and deliberately so, because they far-right is important not because of their popular support, which is marginal in Ukraine in the elections, but they are powerful because of their reliance on violence, and they took part. They were involved in this violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014. And they have power now to overthrow even Zelensky government. So the power of far-right in Ukraine is not at the ballot box or popular support. They are influential because, and they are not represented in the government or in Ukraine, but they are influential because they have a possibility, and they did this already by being involved in a violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government, along with other elements of Maidan opposition and foreign elements, which I described. So in this case, again, this is kind of much more complex. Which
I want to get into that complexity from the let's go to now the post-Maidan. So we accept Maidan. There is evidence linking it to the far right, but we don't know, if I understand you correctly, where there were external involvements, whether it was more than the far right. There's still vague, unanswered questions there, but it's sure it wasn't a revolution of dignity. I think that we can say safely.
Yes, yeah, that's why that's why when I see this term used, this is like kind of for me. This is, I'm not sure. It's a kind of this is like far right term which is used by basically invented by leaders of a party, far right party, which was involved in this basically in this Maidan massacre of their own protesters, including members of Svoboda, who were killed during the Maidan massacre. So this is just there is nothing about dignity, and again, I'm not sure.
But there were signs of U.S. involvement as well. For example, John McCain and Lindsey Graham, senators, went to Ukraine to hand out weapons. There was some video of them circulating. I think it was pre-Maidan. Victoria Nuland had the famous F the EU phone call, for example, where she wanted to handpick the government. So there were clear signs of the US exploiting the situation for as well.
Yes, there was kind of certain evidence of the U.S. involvement, but in case of McCain, he visited Maidan, and he did not distribute any weapons, but he basically supported publicly by giving speech on the Maidan stage. He supported this Maidan protest movement, and this similar kind of actions were done by other politicians, Western politicians. But Maidan protests were actually not very instrumental, or were not responsible for the overthrow of Ukrainian government. So they were not successful. They could not overthrow Yanukovych, and they lasted for a long time, but they could not achieve their goal, because peaceful protest is actually can be popular, or it can be again supported by different countries, like in case of Maidan protest, but it was not successful. It was not able to overthrow Yanukovych. For this reason, the Maidan opposition resorted to Maidan massacre and elements of Maidan opposition. And there is no evidence, direct evidence of Western government involvement in this Maidan massacre, that there were any like Western snipers or again any kind of there are claims by or statements by several ex-Georgian military members who said that they were members of Maidan sniper groups, that one of U.S. citizens who also was linked to far right and was former sniper, was the one who gave them instructions during this Maidan massacre, how to shoot and so on, and he was there. But again, during my research, I cannot say if this is correct or not, but I think there is a very important another kind of piece of evidence in which I can say this is also very important because in a book which was published by two Maidan journalists in Ukraine with interviews with key participants of the Maidan, they gave statements by two leaders of this far-right Svoboda party, in which both of them independently said that there was a meeting with representative of Western countries. They do not say which country, but it's likely it was the United States, based on the content of what they reported. And they said that this representative from the Western country met with them and other leaders of Maidan, and they had discussion, basically, or debates, or even kind of like kind of bargaining about position of the West, basically, about supporting again overthrow of the Yanukovych government, and there was debates or discussion how many people need to be become victims or to be killed for the West to change its position or policy, and to stop recognizing the Yanukovych government and starting to recognize or supporting openly the Maidan opposition as a new government of Ukraine. And there was discussion like 5 at the time. This was I think they said this was around beginning of February or end of January, when already few protesters were killed, again with evidence pointing that they were killed by Maidan opposition, not by the police. Even investigation had similar evidence, but they said that the Western government representative told them that 5 people killed is not enough. that 20 is not enough, 10 is not enough, that 100 would be the number which would be enough for the Western countries basically to stop recognizing Yanukovych and change their policy and start supporting openly Maidan, recognizing Maidan opposition as a new government of Ukraine. And this is what happened on February 20th and on February 18th. This is massacre started and lasted until February 20th. And so about almost 100 Maidan protesters were killed during the Maidan massacre. And Maidan opposition almost immediately started to use term heavenly handed. So they used this term almost immediately after this massacre took place. Even so, the number of killed Maidan protesters were less than 100. They included also Maidan supporters or protesters or people who have who never been on Maidan or were killed, for instance, from suicide or died from health reasons in other places. In Ukraine, they included them into heavenly handed in order to say that there were 100 Maidan protesters killed. And this was very important because Western support for Ukrainian government changing almost immediately after the Maidan massacre, because they blame Yanukovych for this massacre without any investigation, without any evidence. And this is consistent basically with kind of such
and the theory would go they would blame Yanukovych because he was more in favor. He had a better relationship with Russia, right? So
this would be kind of this would, if there was Western involvement in this case, this would be motivated not by any democracy or just internal Ukrainian politics. This would be motivated by Ukraine being a key state, which again, in terms of containing Russia. So Ukraine is a very important state because it borders Russia. It has very close links to Russia, historically and politically. And part of Ukraine was pro-Russian in terms of orientation. I'm saying this body not just, joining Russia or supporting Russian invasion, but with the exception of Crimea and Donbass, this was not the case and still not the case. But they wanted to have, for instance, economic union with Russia and supported close relations with Russia, and of course NATO membership and EU membership of Ukraine, while Western and Central Ukraine supported overwhelmingly pro-Western orientation and pro-Western politicians and wanted to join EU and NATO.
And is that those attitudes consistent with geographic and linguistic distribution?
And this is actually a very good question, because I wrote my dissertation on this very topic, this very issue. And this dissertation was later published as a book by German academic press, and this was done, I started to research this issue in the end of 1990s, because this was very important, very crucial issue. What can explain such regional division in Ukraine, which became very clear after Ukrainian independence in 1991.
Yeah.
And thankfully then there was no civil war or no breakup of Ukraine, which similar to what happened in Moldova, or in contrast to what happened in neighboring Moldova, in which Russian region in eastern part of Moldova seceded. So I examined all the factors which can explain such divisions in Ukraine and Moldova, and I found that this was not just based on geography or based on economics factors. This was based on history. There were different historical legacies in different regions of Ukraine, because Western Ukraine was historically for a long time part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, part of Poland before World War II, and then also part of Romania. Some regions became part of Romania, part of Czechoslovakia, and while Eastern Ukraine historically is much closer to Russia, it used to be a part of the Russian Empire for centuries, and then became part of the Soviet Union immediately after, again, collapse of the Russian Empire after the Bolshevik Revolution. So there were different historical legacies which would have a major factor in explaining such regional divisions in Ukraine, which led to conflict also in Ukraine and and de facto breakup of Ukraine after Crimea, which was most pro-Russian region, and Donbass, also pro-Russian region. They de facto seceded from Ukraine after Maidan took place.
Okay. So, and those divisions post Maidan, it's safe to say they've gotten worse as time went on.
Yeah, I think this is again a kind of very important issue because a lot of media basically started to say that after Maidan, all these divisions disappeared, that there were no such divisions, that they are just invented divisions, they are not real. But actually, what took place in Ukraine, that there was a new line of divisions. So instead of division just between pro-Western and pro-Russian orientations, and politicians kind of taking this broadly as division, in Ukraine, you have a new cleavage emerging, a new conflict, a new kind of area of division emerging. This was supporting basically Russia, joining Russia or not. And this division in Ukraine ran in Crimea, which was a region which supported, according to my research, public opinion polls before annexation and after annexation. This region, which is overwhelmingly ethnically Russian populated, they supported joining Russia. And in Crimea, in Donbass, in this region, I conducted public opinion poll, which was conducted actually, I requested and commissioned a public opinion poll before actually, shortly before the war took place in Donbass, or started in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine. And in Donbass region, there was only one region, with the exception of Crimea, which also supported kind of which a large number of people, close to majority, supported kind of joining Russia or becoming an independent state, and slightly and combined with people who supported federation or autonomous status of Donbass, which were also kind of goals of separatists. They represented the absolute majority of people in Donbass who supported basically some kind of separation from Ukraine. So in this case, there is a new line of division, which actually became much more significant because it became violent in case of Donbass. So this means that division in Ukraine turned from just political division over issues like supporting close relations between the West or Russia, or joining union with Russia, or like economic union with Russia, or European Union or NATO and so on. It became division between supporting basically breaking up of Ukraine or separatists in Ukraine, pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine. And this means there were divisions which became, how to say, along different lines.
Yes.
So they become much more violent, much more significant than before. But in other regions of Ukraine, and most other people in Ukraine, according to my public opinion poll and other evidence, did not support joining Russia. They did not support separatists. So in this case, the division also included regions which were kind of part of eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, because this division line became a new one over issue of supporting not only just Russian orientation, but specifically whether to join Russia or separate from Ukraine. And the same division would apply now for the invasion of Russia, because now the choice is becoming kind of main issue is whether for Ukrainians is whether to support basically Russian invasion and annexing regions basically occupied by Russia or not. And according to all the evidence, again, this new division means that only people in Donbass and Crimea support this, and even people in regions like Kherson and Zaporozhye, which are now occupied by Russia, did not support again joining Russia.
So you can repeat the regions, Odessa and?
This would include like Odessa, but
Yeah.
also regions like Kherson and Zaporizhia, which are now basically controlled by Russia, and Russia now plans to annex them. There is a very limited support for joining Russia. So in public opinion,
And those populations, despite not supporting Russia, they are still Russian-speaking majority?
yes, there is also a linguistic division, because almost half of Ukrainian people are Russian speakers, but language is not, how to say, equivalent with political orientation, because most Russian speakers in Ukraine are ethnic Ukrainians. And so
that's very important, and that's a very important distinction.
yes, because this is a new kind of line of division, because now Crimea, which separated from Ukraine and basically was annexed by Russia, is the only region which was populated mostly not only Russian speaking region, but also mostly ethnically Russian region. And Donbass is a region in which ethnic Russians were plurality, basically close to half of the population was ethnically Russian. And so this means this is would explain why they were different from other regions. But other regions of eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, even so they are Russian-speaking regions, they supported, even so they supported, like pro-Russian parties, supported closer ties with Russia before the Maidan and before the Russian invasion. They supported union with Russia, for instance, and so on, economic union with Russia or political union with Russia. They do not support basically Russian invasion. They do not support annexation of their regions by Russia, and they do not support separatism as in contrast to Crimea and Donbass. And this is again very important distinction, which is often often just people look into this, look into language and use this as a proxy for political orientation, but this is not the case in Ukraine.
Do you think the Russian government is making that important, not making that important distinction themselves as well?
Yes, I think this was one of the miscalculations by Russia, or by one of false perceptions by Russia, by the Russian government. And this started not only with this Russian invasion, but it started with 2014, when the Russian government or Russian politicians and government officials wanted to create basically or support so-called movement of Novorossiya on New Russia in southern and eastern Ukraine, which would include not only Donbass and Crimea, but also would include Odessa region, like Kherson region, Zaporizhia, and Kharkiv region, and in the same eastern and southern Ukraine. But this, according to my research, again, this was based on false perceptions or false understanding of Ukrainian politics, because they assumed that Russian speaking would equate to supporting not only like closer relations with Russia or Russian parties and politicians, but this would immediately be equivalent to supporting basically joining Russia as a not in the form of union or closer relations, in the form of economic union or political union, but becoming just part or region of Russia, similar to what happened with Crimea. So there was an important distinction, which is now also became very clear, because there is no evidence of massive support or significant support for Russian annexation in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, with the exception of Donbass. And this is again would be one of reasons why the war is taking long place. But still, many people there still are Russian speaking, and but this is not equivalent to again to.
That's very important to highlight. I think for anyone taking the conversation forward. I want to ask you, it seems to me the conflict, there's just a lot of wrongs and not a lot of rights in this whole area. The Russia obviously invading illegally, the role of the far right since Maidan, the influential role in violence in the Ukrainian government. I want to just touch one last point on language. The story goes around, and do correct me if I'm wrong here, that the Ukrainian government used language, prioritized the Ukrainian language over the Russian language, and this irritated the Russian-speaking minority. Is that correct? And is there more to that story as well?
Yes, this is correct. And there was a policy, again, after the Maidan, specifically to try to limit the Russian language in use of Russian language, for instance, in the government, in other areas, like in movies, in media. And this policy was continued by Zelensky government, even so he was elected by mostly Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, and he publicly supported different policy which would allow basically equal language rights for the Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. After he came to power, he basically continued the policy of Poroshenko, and trying to basically force Russian speakers to use Ukrainian language in not only in education, for instance, in the government services, but also in the media, and also in even in the like service industry, for instance, in the restaurants, it was required to use Russian language, and so on. Sorry, to use Ukrainian language, and this has became again important political issue in Ukraine, But this was does not mean that people who actually kind of objected to this policy supported Russian.
No, that's fair enough, but one can understand. I mean, I come from South Africa, where language is also a political weapon, especially Afrikaans, which is my home language. And you're in Canada. I'm sure you're aware of Quebec. It's a very similar situation in both countries. I mean, what I don't understand, though, is the Canadian government, knowing what happens in Canada, does not. They unilaterally support the Ukrainian story. Now, I'm not saying one shouldn't support Ukraine or anything of that sort, but I would think that if Canada treated the French speakers like the Ukrainian did the Russian speakers, I mean, how long do you think it will take for Ukraine, for Quebec to be independent? You know?
Oh, yeah, this is like this is again obvious point, obvious issue, and I said in my own interviews, even when Maidan started, I said that the best Western policy to Ukraine, towards Ukraine, would be to support the same policies which Western countries or Western democracies like Canada or Belgium or like the United States supporting their own countries, like about language rights, about democracy, about freedom, and so on. About and I suggested that Ukraine can join European Union to become a basic country, a democratic country like Czech Republic or Slovakia or Slovenia, and would support also all the rights of minorities in Ukraine, including ethnic and linguistic minorities. Opposition would be free and so on, free media and so on. But actually, for political reasons, Western governments, they decided to give priority for geopolitics. So they decided that Ukraine would be most important for them is to use Ukraine to counter Russia, to contain Russia. That's why this Western policy in Ukraine is dictated by geopolitical considerations, even so this means supporting undemocratic actions of the violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014, like supporting policies which are undemocratic and illegal, like language policies and suppression of opposition and suppression of opposition politicians and media in Ukraine. They support such policies because for them Ukraine is most important tool against Russia, and for this reason also Western policy towards Ukraine currently in current conflict with Russia in current war was to use Ukraine basically to weaken Russia or to try to again defeat Russia, or which will be again very unlikely to happen. But they use Ukraine basically against Russia and use Ukraine now as a proxy in a war with Russia without actually deploying the military forces on the ground. So for this reason, actually, this is I consider to be a big tragedy and big problem for Ukraine, because Western policies actually goes against everything which is Western politicians declare publicly. They now basically even support far right, even like Azov, opening neo-Nazi movement, which includes neo-Nazi-led Azov regiment. This is basically now supported by
and is Azov I mean, they use a swastika as a symbol, but are they actual Nazis? Because again, that is even disputed. You know, I find that ridiculous, but I have to ask you the question: are the Azov guys Nazis?
Again, this is a very important question, and I researched this issue even before the Maidan, before actually Maidan took place, and also before actually Russian invasion. And I have my paper presented on this very topic at the American Political Science Association annual conference, and have a peer-reviewed article, which was conditionally accepted for a peer-reviewed journal, but it's still now more than 2 years, it's still not published. I'm not sure if it would be published now because, again, kind of what the politics, and maybe they would be reluctant to do this. Kind of even so, I examined the very issue of far right in Ukraine, including Azov, and how they can be classified. And according to my research, Azov regiment can be classified as led or linked to neo-Nazis because it was created by a neo-Nazi party called Patriot of Ukraine, which was usually part of the right sector, which was involved in Maidan, including the Maidan massacre. So they were led and created by a neo-Nazi party, which was openly neo-Nazi party, which was organization, which also was called Social National Assembly, and used neo-Nazi symbols as its symbols, and its symbols also became symbols of Azov battalion after it was created in 2014. And still Azov, which battalion, which became Azov Regiment now, and was formally incorporated into Ukrainian National Guard. It still was informally led and basically linked to, very strongly linked to this neo-Nazi organization or neo-Nazi party, which now called National Corps, which is a different name, but for the same neo-Nazi organization. And they have now a broad movement, which is again in Ukraine, which is linked to Azov movement. And their Azov regiment was just one of their manifestations, or one of the elements. So we can, because in Azov regiment you have many members who are not, again, neo-Nazis, but many of them are neo-Nazis, and in particular leadership, or they are linked to neo-Nazi organizations and Nazi parties. But many members are not neo-Nazis, or they might be.
I'm struggling to come to terms with the fact that Zelensky is Jewish, and yet in the security forces you have these elements.
Yes, so this is again often used that he's a Jewish. Even so, when he was elected, he did not emphasize this. He now emphasizes this he's a Jewish, that he is Jewish. He emphasizes this in his television appearances and so on, specifically for political reasons, because actually he is actually this actually has not much influence or effect on far-right movement and including the Nazi movement in Ukraine, because actually Zelensky pretends that there is no problem, and the same issue would be basically to say that if Obama was elected president of the United States, there is no racism, there is no basic issue with this discrimination of blacks and so on, or racist issues at all in the United States, or to say that in any other country would be the same issue. Just because you have some leader, this does not mean that you can make a generalization to entire country, to all the situation. And when Zelensky was elected as the president of Ukraine, he actually was elected with support of Azov link movement, which was then called National Guard movement, and they actually supported him during elections by attacking rallies led by then President Poroshenko. So they basically helped Zelensky to get elected for political reasons, and after his elections, he actually could not fulfill his promises of peaceful resolution of conflict in Donbass, because this Azov movement threatened him, and veterans of Azov threatened him basically that he would be overthrown or even assassinated if he would try to pursue a peaceful deal with Russia. So that's why
what you're saying, if I understand it correctly, that a handful of far rights in Ukraine, and they are not represented in parliament,
yes,
they don't represent the views of the average Ukrainian, but a minority of far right Ukrainians stalled the peace process with Russia before the war broke out.
Yes, exactly. They were able to pressure Zelensky, basically to tell him, to threaten him not to pursue any peace deal with Russia. And this is also not just by them. When he visited the front line a few years ago, he was basically met with them, with far-right Azov link unit on front line, and they told him basically not to do any peace deal, and they use they call him names, and he had to basically defend himself. Even so, he's he has power basically. He was elected. He has popular mandate. He has all the security forces, police, but he cannot do anything among just a few thousand of neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And this is not accidental, because afterwards, just about 1 year ago, the same neo-Nazi link far-right movement was, including from Azov, they attacked his presidential office, openly attacked his presidential office, and put a swastika on his presidential office in Kiev, from which he is now give all the speeches, public speeches and so on. They put swastika on his office. They attack his office with fireworks and try to burn this office, and basically openly said that they would attack him if he would pursue policies against their own interests. And police just stood by. So police basically would do nothing, and this is basically tells Zelensky that he is not able to do anything to basically to go against far right, because otherwise he would put his life in danger and his power in danger. And this is like one explanation why far right is so influential in Ukraine, even so they do not have popular support, and they do not have also representation in the parliament or in the government.
So, what this is just an incredible story. You know, the role of NATO. I want you to elaborate on that as well. You know, it's been said Ukraine. There was no plans to get Ukraine into NATO, but I don't think anyone believes that. If you look at the situation, Ukraine was systematically becoming a NATO member. How important was that into escalating this war as well?
Again, this is an issue which I researched professionally, and I just published peer-reviewed paper, an article on this topic, even before this Maidan took place in 2014, about accession of different post-communist countries to NATO and the European Union. And I can say, based on my research, that there were no real chances of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. Right. Even so, there was such a promise given by NATO in 2008. There was no such real possibility of Ukraine joining NATO in the foreseeable future, and in part because Russia opposed this, and because also Western countries like Germany and France in particular, they do not want to accept Ukraine into NATO, because this would mean that that NATO would have to fight war with Russia if conflict between Russia and Ukraine become like a war as it become now. So the NATO did not support NATO. Many NATO countries do not support membership of Ukraine in NATO, but publicly they continue to say that Ukraine would become member of NATO, and Ukrainian government continued to say that Ukraine plans to join NATO. So this was a very important issue, even so. And Putin used this kind of NATO membership of Ukraine to justify its invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But there was no such real possibility. But in addition to this, there were actually NATO countries like the US and other countries used Ukraine to deploy some of weapons to Ukraine, in particular in supporting, and they deployed military instructors in Ukraine after Maidan, and they also used again Ukraine for intelligence gathering purposes, like by using spy planes over Ukraine. But this does not mean that this was immediate threat to Russia, because there was no missiles which can target Russia. There were no nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and there were no military bases of NATO in Ukraine. But Russia used this as again to justify its invasion of Ukraine.
What does the average Ukrainian feel about this whole situation? Because their country is being wrecked apart by obviously by Russia, that's the first culprit here, but then also geopolitical interests.
Again, this is very important question, very important issue, because often in the media and social media, they used to talk. Basically, we need to listen to what Ukrainians want, what they want, what they prefer, and so on. But they often just basically have voice only of Zelensky and representatives for basically like media, journalists, and politicians and NGOs, which are funded by Western governments and foundations, and or linked to to the West. So this is basically a very one-sided and not representative view of what actual Ukrainians believe and they want, because Zelensky was elected by absolute majority of Ukrainians to have a peace deal with Russia. So he had peace mandate. So Ukrainians wanted to have peace. They did not want to get a war with Russia. And after Russia invaded, so Ukrainians, obviously, most of them, absolute majority of them, did not want to support this invasion of Russia. They did not want to join Russia or to be kind of occupied in Russia, to be forced into Russia. But they also again, they would prefer not to have war. They would prefer to have peace, because to fight a war with Russia, this means that there are many casualties of Ukrainians. And Zelensky admitted that at least about 100 Ukrainians just die each day at the war in Donbass, and there are 500 wounded in the war in Donbass. So there are significant and very large number of casualties of Ukrainians killed and wounded during this war. There is enormous damage to Ukraine, and many Ukrainians suffer from this. So I think they would prefer peace and a peaceful settlement.
But do you think Russia would negotiate for peace? Because Russia is attacking. I mean, if Ukraine, I mean, I guess the question is, how do you bring this war to a closing? It's what we've been asking ourselves since January.
Yes, there was again a very important issue which often rarely is mentioned by the Western media and politicians, because there was a real possibility of a peaceful resolution of this conflict. It was possible to prevent this war at the first place, and I suggested this before this war started in 2022. I mentioned in my media interviews and publications that there was a possibility to have a peace deal, which would give Ukraine, for instance, a possibility of joining the European Union in exchange for Ukraine agreement to become a neutral country and not joining NATO, and resolving a conflict in Donbass based on Minsk agreement. But this was not implemented by again, this opportunity was not implemented, and Russia invaded Ukraine. But even after the Russian invasion, there was a possibility, a real possibility of peaceful deal, peaceful settlement, which would still be on better terms than what possible would be.
Because President Macron was saying before the war started, which I think just after it started, he was trying to insist on Minsk too. It was still a position of France. It was elections in France, so he couldn't say it out loudly because he didn't want to lose the elections, and I think he should have said it. But there was a official position of the French government to say, let's try and get Russia to implement the Minsk II protocol.
I think this is I think this is also a problem with France and Germany, because they were signatures of Minsk agreements along with Russia and separatists and Ukrainian government, but they basically did not press Ukrainian government very strongly to implement these agreements, because United States did not want to do this. So this again, France and Germany, they wanted more kind of preferred to have peaceful kind of alternative, but they also could not go against U.S. policy in this regard. And U.S. policy was much more important, because Ukraine became a U.S. client state since 2014, and it became heavily dependent on the United States, and it follows to a large extent U.S. Government policies and on key issues. And for this reason, it became very kind of difficult for Zelensky to do any, or for even politicians like leader of Germany, who suggested also such a possibility of a deal, peaceful deal to prevent this war, to Zelensky just a few days before the war, and Zelensky said that he would not accept this. And I think the one reason is not only Zelensky, but also the United States. And the same issue actually happened at the end of March. There was a real possibility that peace talks between Russia and Ukraine would be successful, and that a peaceful deal would be reached. And this was suggested by both Ukrainian media and Zelensky himself at the time, and by the Russian government officials and by the media, that there was a real discussion of peace deal, which would basically stop this war, and after Ukraine would agree to become a neutral country and not to deploy any foreign military bases and not to have any nuclear weapons. And in exchange for this, Ukraine would be provided with guarantees from the Western countries and from Russia and from other countries like China to become basically to stay a neutral country and to have guarantees of not invasion by Russia or any other country if such deal would be settled. And this was a real possibility, but of such peaceful resolution of this war. But it was ended basically after British Prime Minister Boris Johnson visited Kyiv, and he told Zelensky that the position of the West, so this means not only the United Kingdom but also the United States, which is leading country in the West, basically was not to have any negotiations with Putin, that and that the Western countries would not provide any guarantees in case of such a peace deal. So this meant that the Western countries basically told Zelensky not to have peace deal and to continue the war, because currently this is war is used by the West against Russia, and Ukraine is basically just tool to fight Russia without actually losing lives of Western.
Yeah, but Ukrainians. I mean, if we in the West, and I say West here because I'm part African, part Western. But if we in the West say we care about the Ukrainians, I mean, the first thing you would do is not send them more to them to death, to their own graves, right?
Yes,
You would
this is just. I think this is just a token, because obviously no politician would say that they just want to use Ukraine and to fight to the last Ukrainian with Russia. So they always talk about this, supporting Ukrainians, supporting their sovereignty, and supporting their lives. They care about Ukraine and so on. But in practice, this is like politics. This is like not fairy tale, which many people believe. This is like that the Western governments are just benevolent, that they want to support Ukrainian democracy, sovereignty, and so on. This is real politics, and in real politics, often politicians lie, and they their rhetoric is often different from actually their real actions. And in case of Ukraine, Western governments basically do not care much about possibility of such war between Russia and Ukraine taking place, or even that there will be civil war in Ukraine, when they supported the violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014 by the Maidan massacre. And they also did not want it, the US in particular, they do not want also to stop war in Donbass, end this war in Donbass, or prevent this civil war in Donbass from taking place. Even so, this was again major conflict in Europe with a lot of casualties. And after the Russian invasion started, or even before, they also did not have any strong interest in peaceful deal, which could have prevented this war or resolved this conflict peacefully. So they basically treat Ukrainians just as a tool against Russia. And this is actually a real politics and real policy, which is well documented by a variety of sources, but often misrepresented by politicians and by the media, by giving this kind of fairy tale image of this conflict and politics. And in reality, it's much more problematic, and that's why I'm often pessimistic about real situation in Ukraine.
So you're not optimistic this war is going to come to a closing anytime soon?
I think in this case, the Russia has still military advantage over Ukraine, and the Russia still makes significant advances in Donbass, which is their main area that they're interested in now. And so Russia is likely to kind of military succeed in to a certain extent. Russia is not likely to occupy entire Ukraine, and this was not. I don't think this was the goal of Russia, but they are likely to surrender Ukrainian forces in Donbass or continue their advance in Donbass, which is their main goal, and they might try to expand their control over eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, but they would not be able to, and I don't think that they plan to take entire Ukraine, occupy entire Ukraine, but in this case, still Russia is likely to press Ukraine or to try to force Ukraine to a peaceful deal. But I don't think now that this peaceful deal would be realistic, because Zelensky is under pressure from the West and from the far right not to sign such a deal. So he got a very public image, basically, of this bubble of being a new Churchill, basically a hero and so on, defending Ukraine against Russia. Even so, he is actually, in reality, he's a very weak politician, because he acts under pressure, and he acted under pressure from the West and from the far right. So he failed to prevent this war, and he failed to reach peace deal, because even so he was elected to do this. So in this case, the war would continue, and this is likely to continue for some time, maybe months, and this will be again very damaging to Ukraine and Ukrainians, because in the end, Ukraine is not likely to win and defeat Russia. So that's why I think for Ukraine this is a very big tragedy, because again Zelensky promises all these new weapons from the West would change.
But are weapons going to help at this stage? I mean, we can pump all the weapons in the world, except maybe for nuclear weapons, into Ukraine. Is that really going to deter Putin? I mean, I happen to think the Russians see this as existential, and they're going to fight. And if Russia is defeated, they will use all the arsenal. I mean, this is an enormous. I mean, I don't think people understand the amount of firepower that Russia still has, And yeah, sure, maybe Ukraine wins the war, I don't know, but it's going to blow a big hole into Eastern Europe.
I don't think that there is any real chance that Ukraine would win a war. So this is basically a gamble. Even with chances of Ukraine winning this war are very small, and this was clear from the start. And no matter what kind of weapons would US supply would, or any other Western country supply would match potential military potential of Russia, because Russia still has a large military advantage in terms of kind of artillery, multiple rocket launchers, in terms of other weapons like planes and so on, which can use, and missiles and so on, which can use to basically inflict a very significant damage on Ukrainian forces and to kind of press the advance over Ukraine. So Ukraine has no real, so I don't see any real possibilities that Ukraine would be able to defeat Russia, and which would mean in reality basically just forcing Russia to abandon not only its territories which occupied after start of this war in Kherson and the Zaporizhia region and in Donbass, but also territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which became separatist regions, which Russia recognized as independent republics in before the start of this invasion, and also Crimea. So there is no such real possibility of Ukraine even reversing the outcome of this war and defeating Russians in Donbass and Crimea. So stalemate even again, which would be mean basically returning to the borders to situation before this war started, is also very unlikely, because Russia still has advantage and no military weapons can change this. And for this reason, I also don't believe that Russia would use any nuclear weapons, because there is no kind of real possibility that Russia would suffer again defeat. And they believe that they actually can win still, and they are doing such advances. And this is actually the only problem is, or the only important issue is that this actually, the weapons create a perception among Zelensky, and he believes that Western weapons can change the outcome of this war, or he at least publicly says this. I'm not sure if he just believes this, because he believes that Western countries would provide first a no-fly zone, which was not a real possibility, and now he believes also that new weapon supplies, or that Western sanctions would stop Russia, which also failed to do this. So now he believes that these new weapons, like from the West, will change the outcome of this war, which again are not very likely.
Well, I mean, most of the weapons, I mean, the European Union, I read it somewhere in the papers today, was warning that some of these weapons will end up in the hands of criminal gangsters. And then you have other problems down the head. So whatever, I mean, I'm not a scholar in diplomacy and international relations, but my common sense tells me, yeah, some way we need to negotiate with Russia, even if it's under unfavorable terms, to end the conflict. And I don't think that argument is not opening up.
Yeah, this is again an important issue, which is often is just brushed aside, and because negotiations are treated as surrender or kind of or appeasement. So they all these media politicians, they use this World War II as analogy for current war,
and especially in the UK, you know.
Yeah. For me, this is like I research. I specialize in conflict studies. I research conflict in Ukraine comparatively compared to other countries, and there are many other wars taking place in the world, including in the post-Soviet states, and there is no kind of evidence whatsoever that the war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine is comparable in any significant way in terms of politics to war between to World War II. So this is not World War II, and there is no kind of.
So Putin is not Stalin.
Oh yeah, or Hitler, which is again a very popular image, which is totally this is like very common to identify any kind of adversary of the West as a new Hitler, which was done with Milosevic, with Hussein, and many other kind of leaders of countries. But again, there is no Putin is not a Hitler. Hitler, he's not a Stalin. He basically Putin, and I think in this case there was a real possibility of a peaceful resolution. And if you look into many other conflicts which took place, like I think better analogy would be kind of, for instance, war between Russia and Georgia, or war between Finland and Soviet Union, and many other conflicts which ended with kind of peaceful deal or peaceful resolution, which again can happen without actually Ukraine abandoning its independence. So Ukraine can still preserve its independence and its government. But I think now very unlikely that Ukraine would be able to keep its territories like Ukrainian as part of Ukraine in terms of Kherson and Donetsk and Kherson and Zaporizhia region and also Donetsk region, because they are already basically would be annexed by Russia, and this is actually a tragedy because the longer war continues, the less territory Ukraine will be able to hold, and a more difficult peaceful deal for Ukraine would be to accept. So for such reasons, there may be no peace deal signed. There may be some kind of de facto ceasefire agreement, similar to what happened with war in Korea or war between between the Soviet Union and Japan, when there was no peace treaty signed, but became a de facto line of division. So this may be another alternative when Ukraine would be divided basically, and Russia would annex regions like including Donbass, including Zaporizhia and Kherson regions and other parts of Ukraine in the east and the south that it would be able to seize militarily, and then other parts of Ukraine would stay as a limited kind of Ukrainian state, which would be much bigger and much more much more difficult position because of all the losses and the military losses, civilian losses, and damage to the economy, and a very difficult political situation if Ukraine because Ukraine is not likely to become a European Union member in the near future, even if European Union would recognize now right of Ukraine to join EU or even give status of candidate to European Union membership. This is such membership is not very likely in the near future. It might take 20 years or maybe not at all, depending on the politics. So Ukrainian situation is very difficult, and that's why I'm pessimistic about future of Ukraine, because now we have basically outcome which could have been prevented and which could have been much better to Ukraine compared to what we have now and what can happen in the future if the war would continue.
But it sounds though that you're saying Russia is getting what it wants. Is there any way to deter Russia from grabbing a greater part of Ukraine? I'm thinking here in terms of the BRICS countries, China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa is in a trade agreement, although it doesn't mean much in practice. Is there any way through that to put pressure on Russia to stop what it's doing?
I think Russia. I think originally Russia wanted to have a regime change in Ukraine, so they wanted to have whole Ukraine not occupied, but basically changing regime in Ukraine from pro-Western into pro-Russian, and that's why I think this was the reason why they launched not only kind of invasion to kind of take control and seize Kherson and Zaporizhia region in the south, and Kharkiv also and Donbass in the east, but they also tried to go to Kyiv and the northern part of Ukraine. This was specifically to basically put pressure and try to not to kind of military, not to just try to capture Ukraine militarily. There is no evidence that Russia wanted to do this, but they wanted basically to pressure Ukraine into change of government, to put maybe pro-Russian government if Ukrainian forces would and Ukrainian politicians and government would decide not to fight. Russia would either abandon Ukraine or would just sign a peace treaty. So Russia hoped basically to have a regime change, and to get control over Ukraine without occupying entire Ukraine. So this was, I think, original goal of Putin invasions, and this did not succeed.
Yeah.
So now I think Russia tries to achieve basically its goal of not only its main goal, which was basically to get control over entire part of Donbass, including the ones which was controlled by Ukrainian government before this war, and Russia recognized this entire Donbass as separatist republics, independent from Ukraine, but they also want now to annex other regions of Ukraine. So now Russia has a different focus in which basically outcome would be divided Ukraine, in which one part of Ukraine become annexed by Russia, significant part of Ukraine, but still Ukraine would be preserved as independent state. But this is again can change depending if the war continues. So in such case, if Russia, and this depends on outcome, military outcome of this war, because
But Russia is also getting injured. I mean, we shouldn't forget that. I mean, Russia has. It's difficult getting accurate figures, but the figures I have is something like 20 to 30,000 soldiers have died apparently.
this is all this kind of. So I'm as expert of in conflict studies, which I research many wars professionally. So I research like war in Chechnya, and war in between Russia and Georgia, World War II in Ukraine, and many other wars like war in Donbass. So when I read these numbers like casualties in the media and or mentioned by government officials, they are like this is like for me this is kind of immediately they are very suspect because no government would release actual numbers of their own casualties and the casualties of adversaries, which are released by the media and by politicians, are basically deliberately inflated for political reasons or based on totally unreliable evidence, because there is no way, no possible way to determine how many kind of people of the adversary country, opposing country, were killed or wounded in any attack. There is no way to count this precisely. There is no way to determine this. How many kind of casualties each kind of strike, each shell, each gunshot produced. So there is no way to determine this unless government would admit their own losses, which they are able to determine precisely. So in this case, all these numbers which are given about such number of Russian casualties, I think they are inflated deliberately, and they are kind of specifically not very reliable. But there are obviously there's a lot of evidence that there are significant Russian casualties, military casualties in this war, from a lot of videos which I researched from different sources. But in addition to this, there are also very large casualties among separatists in Donbass, which are also often conflated with Russian casualties, because separatists in Donbass, they are former Ukrainian citizens, or they are still Ukrainian citizens. Some of them joined, many of them became also Russian citizens, but they are still, again, residents of Donbass, and many of them are killed. And according to official estimates or official data which are reported by Donbass, by Donetsk separatist sources, official sources, they reported, I think, almost 2,000 people, members of armed formations and security services and police in Donetsk, so-called republic, which recognized by Russia, were killed in this war. So this is a very large number of casualties, and they are often conflicted with Russia. So I think I think that Russian casualties are deliberately inflated, but because also one way to determine this is to look into kind of number of wounded, because for each number of each soldier killed in any war, like conventional war like this, there would be several soldiers or military personnel wounded. So this means that if we accept that like of this 20 or 30,000 Russian military killed, this would mean that like according to Ukrainian numbers, official government numbers, this would mean that there would be like 150,000 approximately Russian soldiers wounded. So this would basically mean that the entire Russian military are either wounded or killed. So since the start of the war, this is what a number given. So this makes no sense again, and this is just
and if it's a round number, you know already it is.
That's why again, that's why I check this with grain of salt. The same applies to Russian claims about Ukrainian military casualties. They also cite all these numbers. I think they are also inflated, but I can say that that numbers which are given by Zelensky recently, he admitted that there are like from 60 to 100 Ukrainian soldiers killed each day only in Donbass. So this means that there are very large casualties, and for about 500 wounded each day in Donbass. So this means there would be a very large number of casualties. Ukrainian military
500 every week, I guess. Yeah.
So this is like a battalion basically taking place, and this is again very significant casualties which would not be sustainable for a very long time. And I think this is a problem because still Russia has military advantage, and they are able to inflict these casualties not by using kind of all this, how to say, kind of all the weapons which were kind of mentioned by the media, like all the Bayraktars or drones and so on. They use artillery. So a lot of casualties, I think most of casualties are from strikes by artillery and multiple rocket launchers and so on, and by missiles, precision missiles, which Russia has much significant more advantage over Ukraine, and they're able to do this. and inflict such a very large number of casualties on Ukrainian forces. And Ukrainian military is able to do this on Russian forces by also using mostly artillery. It's not javelins, not all this kind of stingers, not all this Bayraktars, but they are artillery, which again is most lethal for both Russian and Ukrainian forces, and they are again very important in determining outcome of this war. But Russia has much bigger advantage over Ukraine in this regard, and that's why they use this advantage in Donbass, and supply of military of such rocket systems from the West would not change the outcome of this balance, because they are not able to match numbers of the Russian forces in terms of their possession of such weapons.
Last question. How stable do you think is Putin's regime in Russia?
I think this is again, there is a talk in the media, like Western media, that Russia is about to collapse. There will be a coup against Putin in Russia and so on. I think this is like wishful thinking, because or just propaganda campaign, because there is deliberate also. I see a lot of evidence that there is a kind of deliberate propaganda, disinformation campaign, like in any war.
Everything I read is skeptical of. I cannot watch the media anymore.
And this is just not only by Ukrainian government or Russian government, but also done by Western governments, which conduct their own proxy war with Russia. So they have incentive to kind of disseminate such stories about Putin being overthrown in a coup, palace coup, or he would have all the illnesses which can lead to his kind of removal, or just he would end his life soon, or that Russia would collapse as a state. So basically there's no evidence to support this. And according to public opinion polls conducted in Russia after the start of this war, Putin became much more popular since the start of this war, and he was able to suppress any opposition to this war in Russia. And the Russian media, which is basically controlled by the Russian state or government, is heavily promoting this war and Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there are no dissent basically in Russia in this regard. And I think the similar situation now is in Ukraine, because in Ukraine only government policy, landscape policy is just supported by the television. There is only one television channel basically in terms of content combined. So there are no opposition, no real opposition in Ukraine. It became suppressed after the Russian invasion. And so I think in this regard, actually, I believe the danger actually of being overthrown is much more significant for Zelensky, because as I mentioned, as soon as he would have to force or try to sign a peace deal with Russia, he would face a real danger of being overthrown by far right, or maybe allied with oligarchs like Poroshenko and so on, and he would be accused of this. So in this case, he is much more kind of dangerous position compared to Putin, because Putin has absolute control over kind of oligarchs in Russia. There is far right, but they are not as influential as in Ukraine. They have and there is no actually real any evidence of real opposition within the military or security forces, or and there is no basically very weak opposition to Putin in the Russia itself. So that's why I think it would be.
And I mean, historically, when Russia had an overthrow of government, I mean, the Tsar got replaced by Stalin. You don't want to even entertain that possibility.
Oh yes, and this is a very also likely outcome. Even if Putin would, for some reason, would be overthrown, or would not likely, but this can happen. Again, anything can happen. Or he might be again killed or assassinated, or anything can happen. Even so, this is not very likely. In such case, alternative would be even much more kind of hostile and much more nationalistic and much more militaristic politician or leader of Russia than somebody like Navalny, who would again become like pro-Western and would end his war with Ukraine. This is not very likely. So more likely outcome is that would be even more hardliners than Putin, and much more kind of a politician who would be much more relying on military force of Russia than Putin is doing right now, because kind of Putin is still kind of trying to offer some peaceful deal with Ukraine and so on. Even so, he launched this invasion. He still kind of offers some possibility of peaceful resolution of this conflict. But alternative would be that a lot of Russian politicians are much more hardline than Putin, And if they would come to power after Putin, they would much more. I think, in that case, future of Ukraine become as independent state might be even much more dangerous, much more problematic. And this is actually worries me as well, because this is real politics. This is not wishful thinking or wishful expectations, which a lot of people actually believe and take this because they want to believe this, so they take this as a real possibility. Even so, actually, reality is much more dangerous and much more problematic than what often is told or presented as a real possibility.
Yeah. Dr. Ivan Katchanovski, thank you very much for the conversation, for sharing your knowledge, and please continue to write about Ukraine. It's very informative. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.